The mystery of human existence lies in not just staying alive, but finding something to live for. Unsurprisingly, most people tend to want a better life. There are whole industries devoted to this idea, with self-help tomes adorning every bookshop from here to Texas. But if you've clicked on this video, then you're different. You don't want to improve your life. Perhaps you're quite happy with it. You want to drive it into the ground as quickly as humanly possible. You want to end up a total miserable failure, not just psychologically, but existentially. Well, it has been a year since I began my quest to explore all the different ways that we can destroy ourselves. And today, I'm proud to present to you the philosophical guide to destroying your life. Follow these steps, and I believe that any blissfully contented soul will soon be a broken wreck, smashed by their own flawed approach to existence. Regular viewers will recognize these thoughts and thinkers from my other videos, and today we'll finally put them to the test. And to begin our journey into self-combustion, I want to start with the most destructive mental state known to man. 1. The Pleasureless Vice. George Will once described envy as the only sin which did not provide a drop of pleasure. Likewise, Aquinas specifically said it was sorrow felt at another's good. It takes a potentially good thing, the fortunes of another person, and turns it into a weapon which we can then use to hurt ourselves. But a close relative of envy is its uglier and even more destructive cousin, resentment. Envy and resentment often go together rather comfortably. However, I think there is one thing which makes resentment even less desirable than envy, and even more prone to ruining your life. Intuitively, whereas envy says, I want what that person has, resentment says, I want that person to lose what they have. Whereas envy seems like it could at least provide a small impetus for improving your own situation, resentment seeks to alleviate itself by making others suffer. The trouble that many thinkers identify with resentment is that it makes a promise that it simply will not keep. A resentful mental state notices that someone else has what we want, but it does not even conclude that we should try to get it ourselves. Instead, it tries to rectify the balance by purely destructive means. The underlying assumption of resentment is that happiness is a zero-sum game, and that if someone else is enjoying life, then they're only doing so by stealing that joy from us. Of course, the most famous analyses of resentment are found in Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and I've covered them both on this channel before, but I want to revisit them here, specifically with an eye to the harm they do both to the resenter and to anyone around them. In Notes from the Underground, or Notes from Underground, we follow a protagonist who openly describes himself as sick and spiteful. Dostoevsky meant for them to stand in for the type of person he thought would become commonplace in a post-religious and materialistic world. But today, we're going to home in specifically on his resentment and his entitlement. The underground man sees himself as almost uniquely persecuted. No one seems to love him, he has no close friends, and he walks around the streets of Petersburg almost searching for things to be aggrieved at. He openly confesses that he is totally unable to feel joy at the successes or happiness of others. And instead, each time it feels like a dagger to his heart. He manages to both perceive himself as above everyone else, an enlightened, modern man who knows the dark truth about the world, and yet also as pathetic and ineffectual. He views reality as one big competitive scoreboard, and says he cannot let go of any perceived wrong. Any slight to his honor or his position or his person burrows deep into his heart, and forms yet another knot of resentment to add to the pile. In fact, the few times we do see the underground man experience pleasure in the novel, it is specifically when he has taken it away from someone else. He has a sick satisfaction when he makes a lady of the night break down with his horrifying predictions of where her life will lead. And he also has some brief glimpses of joy when he is actively ruining the evening of some old school friends of his. And yet, it would not seem right to call this sort of thing happiness, because it is only ever fleeting and almost immediately accompanied with deep regret. When the woman he berated abandons him, he runs after her, before deciding that there's not any point to this after all. And he ends up pursuing these old school friends all across town in the hopes of either winning their affections back or challenging one of them to a duel to restore his honor. Each time, his resentment not only makes him more angry at the world, but it nurses a profound sense of self-hatred within him. Unable to love or feel joy on behalf of others, he finds it impossible to love himself either. Friedrich Nietzsche thought that almost all resentment stemmed from weakness. He thought resentful people were running away from their own inadequacy by trying to tear other people down to their level. The trouble is, this can be a seductive strategy because if you succeed, it works very well in the short term at alleviating discomfort. When the underground man does make someone feel awful, he gets a small thrill and as a result is emotionally rewarded for this behavior. But once this wears off, it is clear that he is just as miserable as he was before and has simply imparted a small part of this misery onto others. He becomes a sort of human emotional parasite who can only survive by destroying and feasting upon other people. And in doing so, he shatters any hopes he could have of happiness as well. The reason I've selected this as one of the key ways we can destroy our own lives is because it is so easy to become resentful. As humans, we are naturally comparative. It is perfectly normal to look at the person next to us and gently hope that we are doing better than them. I don't think that anyone should feel bad or guilty for this, even though I do think it's a habit we would do well to try and combat as much as possible. But at the same time, this can so effortlessly and unnoticeably turn into resentment. And considering the dire consequences of such a shift, I do think this is one of the most useful lessons I have taken from all the philosophy that I have read. Resentment and joy are almost impossible to feel together. Eventually, the underground man enters a vicious cycle where his resentment becomes totalizing. Rather than merely being resentful at individual people, he becomes resentful of existence itself. Having been thrown into a life where he feels miserable, he rebels against that life and enters a fruitless struggle against a world that simply does not care whether he exists. For Dostoevsky, the underground man represents a certain kind of nihilism about life. But on reflection, I think there is even more to it than this. He hates the world for not being how he wants it. For him, this is an injustice on a metaphysical level, and he never moves past this reaction. So he will punish anyone and everyone who crosses his path for the simple crime of being a part of this world he so resents. And perhaps I'm wrong, but I bet that if you searched your own mind, then you'd recognize that sometimes you feel a similar way. The kind of resentment that you or I hold is probably not nearly as extreme and probably felt about not nearly as many things, but it can be just as bitter. The sad fact is that many of us will have already taken the first steps to being consumed by this resentment. And of course, if what we want to do is destroy our lives, then I suggest we plow right on. But next, I want to travel from the 19th century to the ancient world and sample my favourite bit of advice from perhaps the most famous philosophical school in history, the Stoics. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons for access to occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. Delusion and Responsibility. I think that the term responsibility has become such a buzzword in recent years that it has led us into unhelpful extremes in our thinking. On the one hand, some people totally abdicate responsibility for their own lives, claiming no ownership over their decisions and chalking everything up to merely external factors. But on the other hand, I've also seen an increasing number of people claim that we are totally responsible for everything that happens in our lives. This is a fun idea, and it would make existence totally meritocratic, but it just also seems straightforwardly false. There are mistakes I've made in life that are my fault. I got fined by the council for not putting my bins back in after collection day the other week. But there are also misfortunes, things that have befallen me that were outside of my control. For example, I suffer from chronic pain, and as far as I can tell, it was not a result of my behavior, but rather a genetic predisposition coupled with some rather awful luck. So the question remains, what ought we to take responsibility for, and what can we safely wash our hands of? And one of my favourite views on responsibility was formulated thousands of years ago by Stoic philosopher and regular on the channel, Epictetus. Epictetus was a slave in the rather brutal Roman system. He was the property of a cruel master who once broke his leg seemingly just for the fun of it. So Epictetus had to find a way to deal with this. He was in a situation that is far more difficult than anything most of us will ever have to face, and yet he somehow did not let it break him. His version of Stoic philosophy heavily draws from his own personal experiences, and the beating heart of it is the division between the things that we are responsible for and the things that we are not. For Epictetus, we must take brutal and total responsibility for our minds and our actions. That is, we should not fool ourselves into thinking that our behavior is outside of our control. Our decisions are certainly shaped by outside influence, but they are still our decisions. As a side note, if you're a determinist, you can still use this approach, you just have to take a compatibilist definition of responsibility. But caveats aside, Epictetus thinks that our conscious thoughts and our actions are those things which we can directly change. Additionally, while we may not have the same sort of direct control over our emotions as we do over our deliberate thoughts, we can still train ourselves to deal with these emotions in a more intentional way over time. For Epictetus, this does not mean suppressing them, but rather acknowledging them and investigating their causes, so that we can manage our reactions to them with a lot of time and a lot of practice. If you're familiar, this is a bit similar to the Aristotelian notion of habituation. For Epictetus, a lot of suffering is caused by pretending that we are not in control of ourselves, because, to put it bluntly, it makes us give up very easily. It also makes us think that our happiness solely depends on certain conditions in the outside world being met. Since Epictetus had to learn not to crumble when he was literally owned by a sadist, relying on the outside world simply wasn't an option for him. For him, to not take responsibility for our minds and actions is just to leave our happiness up to chance and the winds of fate. To give it a fun label, we might call this responsibility underreach. On the other hand, given his background, Epictetus was keenly aware that we did not control the world beyond ourselves. Take him, for example. He was evidently incredibly intelligent, diligent, and wise. And yet he was born a slave. So a huge portion of his material circumstance was completely outside his control. Likewise, the philosopher Boethius was, by all accounts, a just and virtuous administrator. And yet it was this very quality which caused the more corrupt factions in the Byzantine government to conspire against him and eventually have him executed. In other words, to pretend that the world itself is in our direct control is ludicrous. We may use our behavior to influence the world, but we have no guarantee of success, and to imagine that we do is reckless optimism. For Epictetus, this is another great cause of suffering. We think we can control the world when at most we can control ourselves. Importantly, he doesn't think this means we shouldn't try to do things to affect the world, but rather if we fail in our aims, this is not always because of something about us. We are a relatively small piece of the causal chaos that rampages through history, and that is okay. But Epictetus thinks we forget this, and begin to take responsibility over things that we are simply powerless to change. When we say this out loud, it can sound obvious, but it is so easy for it to slip our minds. When we aim for a certain outcome and immediately beat ourselves up when we do not achieve it, Epictetus would say we are taking responsibility in an inappropriate fashion. Or, to again put a neat label on it, we are falling into responsibility overreach. For him, the question we should really ask is, were my mind and actions best organized to achieve this aim? We can blame ourselves for playing our cards poorly, but not for receiving the ones we happen to be dealt. So, if we are aiming to be as miserable as possible, then it's very much worth reversing Epictetus's formula. First, we must pretend that we cannot do anything to change our own thoughts and actions. We must convince ourselves that these are all out of our hands, pointing the finger at anyone but us. But at the same time, we must take responsibility for anything and everything outside of ourselves. We must hinge our self-worth on all that is outside of our control. Whether it is the state of our country, our ability to fix other people, or some grand moral project, we should not think, I'll try my best to achieve this aim while recognizing that a large part of it is not up to me, but rather, this is mine and mine alone to solve. And if I do not, then I am a failure and it will never get done. There is no hope and I am worthless. If done well, this will keep us viewing ourselves as a total failure and will probably have us deep in despair. After all, we will never run out of things to take responsibility for, and the one thing we wash our hands of will be the very thing that could bring us joy. However, there is a potentially dangerous misinterpretation of this Stoic idea, and that would be to say, right, I will only care about myself then. But, as we shall see, we can just as easily tear ourselves apart in our pursuit of egoistic hedonism. 3. The allure of self-obsession. Egoism is one of those approaches to life that is enchanting because of its promises and its surface-level logic. If we want to live a life that is best for us, then why not only care about ourselves and screw the rest of the world? We may even fall into the trap of interpreting Stoicism in just this way, as I've seen many people do online. But a number of philosophers have heavily critiqued this standpoint from various different angles, and I would like to explore just a few of them now. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle famously declared that man was a political animal. And while he meant something quite nuanced, it is a little bit similar to how today we might say that we are social creatures. For Aristotle, it was just part of our fundamental needs as humans to belong to some sort of community. He particularly praised the idea of friends, and especially friendships of virtue. He thought these could bring comfort, security, pleasure, and help improve our moral character. Importantly, he often viewed an over-concern with the self as a severe vice, and something that would eventually bring misery to anyone who strayed too far down that route. The general thrust of this attack is found in many forms throughout his works, from the way he critiques the ungenerous, to the hateful, to those who used others purely for their own personal gain. He did not just seem to think these were wrong, but actively made the egoistic person's life worse. This is partly for the intuitive reason that this will piss people off and eventually leave us alone. It sounds like a rather banal point, but it is worth noting. When we are totally on our own with no friends, loved ones, or people that care about us, we are often pretty miserable. And if Aristotle is to be believed, this is almost always the end result of only caring about ourselves. It alienates those around us, depriving us of a base-level human need. And interestingly, this dovetails quite nicely with the thoughts of a lot of other philosophers. I've talked about this quite recently on the channel, but C.S. Lewis defined pride as not necessarily thinking too much of yourself, but thinking of yourself too much. And likewise, he did not view humility as some kind of self-abasement, but rather a pleasant sort of self-forgetting. Anecdotally, this makes a lot of sense. Some of the most pleasant periods of my life have been those where I just haven't thought about myself very much at all, and instead had my attention pointed towards either a task or other people. By contrast, when I dwell on myself and my ideas about myself, this is normally accompanied by harsh self-critique and brutal self-evaluation. In the diaries of Franz Kafka, he often alludes to a similar thing. In his more miserable entries, he is often reflecting upon himself, and this turns negative rather quickly. Fascinatingly, this connects quite strongly with what the developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott used to say about self-focus. According to him, a strong and confident person often manages to forget themselves because they are simply relaxed about this topic, and so it can fade into the background of their mind. By contrast, he thought that an excessive focus on the self, even in supposedly self-aggrandizing instances like narcissism, was a crude form of defense to protect a rather tender ego that was never strong enough to go unwatched. For him, an over-concern with the self was both the cause and the consequence of an awful lot of upset. To take a totally different angle, many philosophers have talked of the importance of being recognized by an equal. I've talked about this a fair amount recently, so I won't go into too much detail. But essentially, thinkers like Hegel or Axel Honneth have noticed that we humans have a need for someone we deem as a peer or superior to look at us and affirm our dignity and our worth. Again, this has recently found some support in developmental psychology, where peer and caregiver recognition and acceptance are considered very important for our well-being. But this does also present a challenge for anyone holding an egoism that is born out of a sense of superiority. That is, someone who fundamentally considers themselves above other people. The trouble is, when someone does not recognize anyone else as their peer, then there is also no one there to recognize them. And yet, at the same time, this gives them nothing they can confirm their superiority with. There is no one they can turn to recognize them, since there is no one they consider an equal, and yet they still have this human craving for recognition. Thus, far from being a strength, their sense of superiority is the very thing that damages them further. So, if we're trying to maximize our despair, then it is important that we learn from the thinkers in this section. Firstly, we should absolutely make sure that we are alone, with as few friends as possible. If we do, unfortunately, end up with friends, then we should ensure that these are not friendships of virtue, but instead those that encourage our worst and most self-destructive habits. Moreover, we should constantly be thinking about ourselves. We should never forget us for even a moment and lose our egos in activity or community, but instead be constantly re-evaluating where we are in relation to other people. We should approach every situation solely concerned with how this will affect us. Not only will this push away anyone around us, making us more and more isolated, but it will also hopefully provoke a sense of superiority in us. We should imagine ourselves as simply better and cleverer than anyone else, with nothing to learn from other people and no equal in sight. This will both add to that all-important sense of resentment and prevent us from breaking out of our own worldview. After all, if we are so much better than everyone else, why can we not feel happy when other people seem content with their lives? The sense of superiority and pride will become a fragile protective shell that we are so loath to get rid of that we would rather fall into despair while believing that we are uniquely brilliant than reclaim a touch of happiness at the cost of some humility. As the character of Satan put it in Milton's Paradise Lost, we will convince ourselves that it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But next, I want to zoom out and talk about one of the key focuses of existential philosophy since its inception, the idea of purpose. 4. Living for nothing. The idea of nihilism has been something of a hot topic in the past 200 years of philosophy. I have a whole video on proposed definitions of the word, so I won't go into too much detail here. But broadly, philosophers have tended to characterize it as a lack of values. However, this in turn can seem a little bit nebulous. After all, what exactly is a value? So instead, here I will treat it as a lack of organization in life or in will. This is partly drawing from Nietzsche and his concept of the disorganized will. The idea here is that a non-nihilist will have an answer or set of answers to the question, what are you doing all this for, that intuitively gives the rest of their life that ineffable sense of fullness that we seem to crave. Historically, many people have found this in religion, but in an increasingly secular world, this single answer may no longer be sufficient. Each of us may have to confront the question, what gives my life meaning, for ourselves? And this is a pretty unenviable task because it lies at the intersection of reason and emotion, of intellect and of instinct. So, let's see what a few thinkers had to say about it. For instance, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard thought that the notion of commitment was key to finding a sense of meaning in life. Oftentimes, he meant this as specifically religious commitment, but his point has far broader relevance than this. According to him, if we do not take a leap of faith and consciously try to find at least something meaningful, then our lives will become aimless. We will flit from one pursuit to another, never settling into the depths of a single life, and instead trying to live several at once. He sometimes describes this as a despair of possibility. For him, it is often only after committing to something that we find the more satisfying levels of meaning that lie within. And this does require a leap of faith to bridge the gap. It's a bit like hiking a mountain. It is only after a prolonged period of striving without knowing whether there'll be a glorious view at the top that we will ever get the chance to see that view. Kierkegaard's ideas here make sense given how we frame the discussion as finding organizing principles for our lives. It may take an act of semi-irrational commitment to stick by a set of values long enough for them to lend this structure to our existence. While Kierkegaard is applying this logic to the concepts of meaning and religion, it is surprisingly transferable to mundane situations. For example, it's only by foregoing learning other skills that we will become great at a single one, and it's only by spending a prolonged period of time with a few people that we will forge close bonds with them. To take a different perspective, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre used to talk about the importance of living authentically. By this, he meant a whole host of things, and again, I've got a full video on him if you want a more nuanced take. But it partly involves learning to detach from the scripts we've culturally inherited and asking ourselves the honest question, what do we want to live for? This is no easy task because it involves extreme and accurate self-reflection, and this, in turn, is quite a difficult skill to develop. It's one that I certainly need to work on. Now, I do not think we are in 100% control of what kind of life or values will make us fulfilled. Partly this is because of fundamental human needs we all have, but also by the time we can reflect upon ourselves, we already have traits that have been given to us either by genetics or by our upbringing. And these may affect the kind of values that can fulfill us. But either way, Sartre would suggest that it is up to us to craft these values that seem to resonate with us and then live by them. Or, as he puts it, to forge our own essence. Without this, he thinks life will just seem empty to us, a kind of dull sickness that we can never quite shake. Alternatively, Albert Camus, especially in his earlier works, wanted us to try to move past a need for meaning altogether. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he suggests that our desire to have meaningful lives is something we can unlearn. And once we do this, the distress of existence seeming meaningless will simply evaporate. Rather than trying to make our lives meaningful, he wants us to accept that they are meaningless and move forward from there. This is part of what he means by his famous phrase, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." In ancient Greek myth, the Corinthian king Sisyphus was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to have it fall down once again when it reached the top. Camus likens our lives to this situation. He says we too are engaged in pointless cyclical activity that is in service to nothing at all. But he says we can gradually learn to be okay with this. Once Sisyphus realizes there is no way out of his predicament, then there is nothing to do but find happiness in it. It bears a passing resemblance to Nietzsche's concept of active nihilism that he mentions in some of his notebooks. However, you are here to learn how to ruin your lives, not find meaning in them, so we must run in the direct opposite direction from all of this advice. Following Camus' analysis, we can see the distress of meaninglessness as a discrepancy between a desire for meaning or purpose and the universe's stubborn refusal to give us one. Thinkers like Kierkegaard and Sartre make up for this discrepancy by suggesting we should find meaning either by faith, for Kierkegaard, or through authentic action, for Sartre. Camus tries to solve the issue from a different angle and suggests we can move past the need for meaning entirely. But if we really want to maximize our suffering, then it's imperative that we take neither approach. We must remain in this discrepancy at all costs. We must notice ourselves crying out for meaning and yet refuse to do anything about it. We should sit around bemoaning the meaninglessness of existence and yet take no action towards either meaning creation or an absurdist acceptance of life's emptiness. We must live our lives not in imitation of Sisyphus, but of Tantalus, who is condemned to be eternally thirsty and eternally hungry and yet can never find any food. We must amplify our wish for meaning as much as possible, while doing everything we can to place it out of our reach. We must never make peace with our situation, nor attempt to change it. There are many ways we might achieve this. We might live only for the demands of others and never ask what we would find meaningful. We might skate across the surface of life, rejecting any form of commitment, never sticking by anything or giving it our serious, sincere attention or care. We might become eternally ironic or performatively pessimistic. But we should never stop and ask the question, how do I solve the problem of meaning in my life? Because as soon as we do this, a valuable source of our misery may be snatched away. But lastly, the trouble with all of these steps is that they leave the door open for us to change our ways. So finally, we must go from Western philosophy to Buddhist thought and confront the issue of our identities. 5. This is just who I am. Many early Buddhist thinkers talked an awful lot about the concept of the self and of identity. In their minds, the very idea of a self was itself an illusion. They held that there was no fixed object that is us. The self was just a convenient pragmatic label for the nebulous bundle of qualities, propensities, and behaviors that seem to come packaged in the same body. And the Buddha said that identifying too strongly with any particular one of these properties was a potential recipe for disaster. This is perhaps most intuitive with properties like youth or beauty. While we may want these things, when we identify with them, we become incredibly distressed when age and time inevitably come to take them from us. But if we want to truly make our lives as terrible as possible, then let's not beat around the bush. Instead, let's try to identify specifically with the behaviors that drive our self-destructive spirals. For instance, it may not be enough to simply feel resentment. We must train ourselves to be resentful over and over again until we can look in the mirror and say, I am a resentful person. Once this has become a habit and has been absorbed into our identity, it will be all the easier to continue this pattern of behavior and all the harder to dismantle it. We will be carried by the inertia of identification. Similarly, let's not just be egoistic, but openly declare ourselves an egoistic person, as if we can never hope to be anything but this. Don't stop at just despairing at life's meaninglessness. Declare this as the only position worthy of an intelligent person. If you can, stake your self-worth and identity on the very things which bring you the most suffering. At the same time, view any alternative behaviors or standpoints in a negative or derisory light. We should find any excuse to dismiss potentially positive changes as foolish or cope. We should keep our minds closed to other ways of living and assure ourselves that we already know what's best. This mixture of intellectual arrogance, clinging to a destructive identity, and rejecting any possibility of change will ensure that we not only start along the road to despair, but stay on it through thick and thin, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. This is the final nail in our coffin. By its very nature, it cuts us off from potential escape routes. It leaves us with nowhere else to go, but one step deeper into the hole we have dug for ourselves. Perhaps this is the most insidious form of self-deception, to think that we are uniquely damned, that despite there being hope for everyone else, we are different. We are the sole figure amongst mankind that can never change. To engage in self-destructive behaviors is one thing, but to be a self-destructive person requires its own horrible jump in logic. It assures us that there is no turning back, that it is simply too late for us. A Christian might call this spiritual despair, while a Buddhist would say it is a form of Maya. But whatever label we give it, we should recognize it as our greatest ally in our quest to ruin ourselves. If the other behaviors we've looked at show us the road to hell, it is identification which locks the door behind us. But perhaps you do not want this fate. Perhaps there is another way to live. And if you want to use philosophy to help you achieve fulfillment rather than rob you of it, then there is no better place to start than Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And I have a video on this very subject right here. I hope you enjoyed the video, and best of luck.